let me take a pause and a minute to say give you my own personal journey. In my journey, when I was a student at the university, I was a socialist, like everybody else. When I started working in the 1960s, I saw how Nehruvian socialism was taking us to a dead end. And then I converted to the Swatantra Party. And, and at that time, I met Pilu Modi, Minu Masani, and even Rajaji. And and when the reforms took place in 1991, I had become a libertarian. Now, a libertarian believes in maximum individual liberty and a minimalist state, like a chowkidar state, which is essentially in charge of security. Of, say, you have the police, you have the army, and those are the core, the judiciary, the core functions of governance. It's a state in which citizens are extremely jealous of their liberties and will not allow the state to become too powerful. However, 1991 onwards, when our economy started growing and prosperity began to spread, I realized that there was still a lot of corruption in the country. So, so I was bothered by that, and I realized that actually you needed the government, you needed the state. The state was not a second order phenomena, it was a first order phenomena. I used to believe that the market was a first order phenomena and the state was a second order. So I at that is when I wrote. I had to the libertarian phase was reflected in a book that I wrote called India Unbound, and the stories that I told you about the bureaucrat, the Vicks vapor rub, the problem of my fear that I might go to jail because we produced too much Vicks vapor rub. Those were stories I told in India Unbound, which made me a libertarian. But then what happened was I was concerned with corruption and I was concerned about moral failure. And the moral failure is what I recounted in The Difficulty of Being Good. And in fact, I wrote then a book in which I turned from being a libertarian to a classical liberal who realized that the role of the state was an important role. Because I mean, the book India Grows at Night, I didn't complete the title, the full sentence of the title. The full sentence is India grows at night when the government sleeps. I thought that was too insulting. But that is how a lot of Indians were feeling. Because India's story was a story of private success. That story from 1991 was a story of private success and public failure. So what bothered us at that time? What bothered us at that time was the fact that state capacity was an issue. The modern liberal state is based on three pillars. One is the pillar of the executive. The executive in such a state, you need for it to be strong in order to get things done. The second pillar in this of the state is the notion of the rule of law. The action of the state has to be bounded by the rule of law. And the third pillar of the state was accountability. That is, the action of the state has to be accountable to the people. That is the democratic ideal of the modern liberal state. The problem is that unlike the pillars of this house, the pillars of the three pillars here do not necessarily reinforce each other. They often contradict each other. And so the question is, how do you balance this idea of, how do you balance this idea, or how do you balance the three pillars of a liberal state? Now, our failure in India, when we talk about public failure, is, for example, why does it take us 10 to 15 years to get justice in the courts? Why are there millions of people who are under trial? A primary failure of state capacity in the country. Why does a bureaucrat who works 12 hours a day and is hugely efficient and gets so much done get promoted on the same day as another bureaucrat who sits in the next office, who works 2 hours a day and does nothing except politic and drink tea? That is what kind of an organization, what signal does it send to the high performers, and how demotivating it is to them. So the third example, the police. Why is it that I would be scared to go to the nearest police station on Lodi Road? I don't trust the police, because I think the police is just the handmaiden of the chief minister. And so what we need then are reforms of governance. And they're not going to be easy, because India's history is a history of a weak state and a strong society. Unlike China's history, which is a history of strong state and a weak society. And the reality is, you need a strong state to get things done, and you need a strong society to make that state accountable. You need both. China is an example of one, and India is an example of the other. I'll illustrate it through history. China's history was a history of empires. India is a history of kingdoms, of competing kingdoms. The fact is that we had 4 empires in our history: the Maurya, the Gupta, the Mughal, and the British. All 4 were weaker than the average Chinese empire. And so China's always had a strong state, and India's always had a strong society. Now, what does this mean? For example, the Chinese, in the case of China, the emperor owned the land. In India, owned the land, and he basically was able, and it was through his goodwill that people got their ownership of the land. In India, the king is always told that his share, he doesn't own the land. In fact, in this book, which I edited, by Thomas Troutman in the Earth, which is on the Arthashastra. The lesson from the Arthashastra, which this particular edition, which has been written by Tom Troutman of the University of Michigan, and I had the privilege of being the editor in my series on economic history. In this, it says that the king is told that you do not own the land. You have a right, a share of the produce of the land, depending on how well you govern and how much you benefit the people in terms of the security you provide, in terms of the infrastructure. Infrastructure, of course, is the modern word, but that's what they were talking about, roads and bridges, etc., that you provide for the benefit of the people. And so he's told that his share of the just share, according to Raj Dharma of the king, is Shat Bhaga in Sanskrit, which means 1/6, which is equal to 15%, which is the tax rate of Singapore. That is the just tax rate of the classical Indian state. And the same principle is repeated in the Shanti Parva of the Mahabharata in book 12 of the epic. Now, another point that of contrast between China and India is that the Chinese emperor gave the law. In India, not only did he give the law, the emperor in China, but he also interpreted the law. In India, the king is told, and this goes back to the first kingdom, the Nanda dynasty in Patliputra, the king is told that he has to abide by dharma, meaning the law, dharma has preceded the king. And what he is told is that dharma means, the Raj Dharma is an action that benefits the people. And the interpreter of dharma is not the king, but the Brahmin. So very early on in our history, we created a liberal division of powers between those who gave the law and those who interpreted the law. And so we have a robust liberal tradition in our country where the king's power has been circumscribed. The just tax rate is 15%. The power to interpret the law does not belong to the king. Anyway, so the other difference, of course, being this all constrained the power of the state and explains why it's a weak, India has had a weak state. And in India, the society was strong. The Brahmins, the oppression in India did not come from the king. Oppression came from society, from the Brahmins. And the savior of the people against that oppression was, in fact, were the gurus, the renouncer, the Buddha, and the bhakti saints who came to the aid of the Dalits, the ordinary people, against the power of the Brahmins. And this is why in 1947, India could only become a democracy and China could only have become a totalitarian state. I mean, if you go by historic determinism, which explains the difference between India and China, but also explains the fact that why India's success is a success from below and China's success is a success from above. which is to say that in China you've had a very impressive, a, a meritocratic bureaucracy which has created the most amazing infrastructure, and that has resulted in the rise of China. In India, I'm afraid it is really almost a success, or it's a success of the people, of its entrepreneurs, and it's a success almost despite the state. And that is why today the need of the hour are governance reforms, reform of the bureaucracy, the police, the judiciary, the parliament, the whole system. Why we are in election mode all the time. There's something wrong with that. I'm going to talk about another classical debate in liberalism, and that is between negative and positive liberty, which was frankly based on a wonderful book by the political philosopher Isaiah Berlin. Isaiah Berlin, who is one of the founders of the State of Israel and was a professor at Oxford at Balliol College. In fact, he had invited me. I did my undergraduate in philosophy at Harvard, and Isaiah Berlin had come there and given a course which I had taken. And then he had invited me to come and do PhD at Oxford. But the last minute, I decided that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life at that stratosphere of abstract thought, and instead took time off. And while I was taking the time off, I decided to get a job and started selling Vicks Vapor Rub. And like the man who came to dinner, I stayed on in the corporate world for a number of years. Anyway, so Isaiah Berlin wrote a book called The Two Concepts of Liberty, in which he distinguished between positive and negative liberty. Now, classical liberals immediately, instinctively believe in negative liberty. Negative liberty is liberty from the state. In other words, it's a liberty which essentially believes in the notion of equality before the law. It believes in the notion of the Chowkidar state, and it limits itself to an equality of that nature. That is to say, a rich man and a poor man, when they are in the police station or in a judge's court, they should be treated exactly alike. However, the notion of positive liberty grew out of socialism and communism, and later was articulated very well by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum in their books. And this is the notion, going back to the Greeks, to Aristotle, which is the notion of human capabilities, of human potential. And they argued that that a flourishing life, as Aristotle talked about it, consisted of every human being having a chance to reach his potential. And this was a persuasive argument, and now I think it's not just limited to those in the Marxists or socialists. A lot of us believe in it, and I believe in it, and that is the notion that of equality of opportunity. That whereas Marxists believed in the equality of result, which is to say that if you have one child, then you deserve to live in a one-bedroom house. If you have two children, you have a two-bedroom house. But everything else is the same. You live in exactly the same house, whether you are a senior bureaucrat or whether you are a poor person. You have the same clothes. You don't distinguish yourself in a way in wealth and in possessions. Uh, and this, of course, created its own problems, which I'll discuss in a minute. But to talk about equality of opportunity, I think is to me a very good idea. And equality of opportunity is mainly achieved through um, good, giving everybody a good education, in giving everybody a chance for health care, in having a safety net for the poorest, so that that nobody falls below the absolute minimum of poverty. All these, then, when you provide these, you give everybody an equal chance. And this is where I think is a far fairer way, fairer society. And I'm not a believer in reservations. If we had equality of opportunity, we would not need reservations that we've had to do. I mean, I think reservations have served their own purpose, but clearly uh, it's far superior to give everybody a head start. Now, I'm not saying that it's easy. We have everywhere in the world, it's been found difficult. Rich people always have the resources to be able to send children to better schools than the poor. And no matter how hard societies have tried to make their schools equal, it has been difficult. But nevertheless, it's a good aspiration for us to have. The problem with equality of results is the problem of a communist state, where there is then no incentive in society to perform. Since everybody in that state is a member of the civil service, whether you're a taxi driver or a waiter or a bureaucrat, everybody is an employee of the state. And it's a job for life. So, and also, there's no material incentive to perform. And so whether you work or you don't really work, you keep your job. And that, of course, is demotivating. So it requires a level of ego. I mean, if you can shrink your ego that far, then you can probably have it. But I don't think the human ego will shrink that far. So that's the flaw in the equality and having absolute equality. I'm going to talk about another idea of liberalism, which is the notion of free speech. Now, we have many freedoms guaranteed in our Constitution. One of them is the freedom of speech. And one of the things that upsets many of us is the attempt by the state, the Indian state, to censor. They censor our movies, they censor our books, they ban books at the drop of a hat, they close exhibitions of artists. And really, this is disturbing. This is illiberal behavior on the part of the state. Now, the state says that we are doing this in order to preserve peace and harmony. And there is a point in what they're saying, because after, the experience of partition was a very, very painful one for the country. And so this was the argument used when they banned, for example, Rushdie's satanic verses in India. They remembered the partition. However, I, as a classical liberal, really believe that we as a society need to grow up. And to grow up means that we shouldn't be so thin-skinned and take offense that I'm offended by what you say. And this was, I think, to me, almost the model of behavior is the one illustrated by an American judge who, in the 1970s, when I was visiting America, this thing happened. The Nazi Party of America wanted to take a procession out in a Jewish neighborhood. In fact, in a town called Skokie, Illinois, where 85% of the population was Jewish. The Jews went to the court and they said that, look, this procession, they plan to wave swastikas, they plan to shout pro-Hitler slogans, and many of the people in our society are the survivors of the Holocaust, and it will be offensive to us. And this went all the way to the Illinois Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court of the Illinois, the judge said, look to the Jews, that look, you close your windows, you put on your TV sets very loud so you don't hear anything outside. But I cannot stop people from this basic freedom that they have, freedom of speech and movement that they have. I cannot stop it. The only basis for stopping human beings is when life is in danger. And life is in danger, for example, in a theater, when somebody yells fire and it yells it frivolously, and there's a stampede and people get crushed. Now that's the danger to society. And I would stop that, but I cannot stop this. So I think this is an example for us in India. An example to tell people that, look, don't take offense. As long as the person is not physically going to hurt you, we cannot stop people using the words that may be offensive.